We have Meghan Markle's biggest exposer, which is John Lefebvre. Meghan Markle is a yacht girl. This guy is huge, guys. This guy knows what he talks about because he was he used to organize these kinds of parties for his clients.
It started quietly. No press release. No announcement. Just a name suddenly climbing the trending list again, wrapped in old whispers that many believed had been buried for years. And that's how these stories always return.
Described Meghan Markle as previously having been a, quote, yacht girl, there have been more revelations going viral from the past.
Not with proof, not with clarity, but with questions. Questions that refuse to stay unanswered. For Meghan Markle, the return of those questions has become a familiar pattern. Every time the public thinks the narrative has settled, something pulls it back open.
How do you know this guy? Well, he's a photographer. He's based in Florida. I was doing some stuff with him. Okay. I said, who is the person we're talking about here? Before I call my lawyer and get anybody involved in this, you have to tell me. So then she says, her name is Meghan, and she's about to marry.
A resurfaced clip, a forgotten interview, a comment from someone who claims to have known her before the palace gates ever opened. And once the door cracks, the internet rushes in. Critics argue that Meghan's rise was never just about talent or timing.
Dan, and I'm sure you are as well. I've been familiar with it for a long time, and in fact, I've seen the tapes. I've got them somewhere, God knows where now.
They point to the speed of her transformation, from struggling actress to global icon, as something that demands explanation. In Hollywood, success is rarely accidental, and observers have long questioned what really happened in the years before her royal introduction.
Why these pictures are so problematic for Meghan Markle is because these pictures place her with Jeffrey Epstein.
Years that, according to online commentators, appear increasingly edited. Long before royal titles and humanitarian speeches, Meghan was trying to break into an industry that rewards access as much as ability. Former acquaintances and commentators claim she moved through elite circles with remarkable efficiency.
What I've seen, I think I have a room for doubt about. Others, let's resile away from a comment.
Appearing at exclusive events, luxury gatherings, and private social spaces usually reserved for the already powerful. To supporters, this was ambition. To critics, it was strategy. The controversy deepened when family members entered the conversation. Public statements from her half-brother reignited debates many thought were settled. Not because they offered proof.
Who was also part of that circle. We have her friends calling her for yacht week as early as February 2016, right before she met Harry.
But because family accusations carry emotional weight, they feel personal. They feel insider. And once those words are spoken, they can't be unsaid. Online investigators began stitching together timelines. Old photographs were scrutinized. Guest lists revisited. Events once dismissed as coincidence were re-examined with suspicion. None of it confirmed.
Markle in 2006 at the Hamptons, at a Hamptons party where Harvey Weinstein was there.
None of it resolved. But enough, critics say, to challenge the carefully curated origin story presented to the public. Silence followed. No lawsuits, no firm denials, no direct rebuttal. And in modern media culture, silence is rarely neutral. Supporters describe it as dignity.
I'll show you this from a man called Kevin Blatt. Now, he is a celebrity tape broker, Lady C, and this is from a show called Your Mom's House.
Critics interpret it as calculation. Algorithms, of course, interpret it as engagement. As the speculation grew, so did the stakes. Meghan was no longer just a former actress or even a duchess. She became a symbol in a larger cultural battle. To some, she represented reinvention. To others, she embodied manipulation.
Markle did a yachting week in February. I wonder if that is where she actually met Harry.
The debate was no longer about what was true, but about which version people wanted to believe. What makes this story persist is not evidence, but contradiction. Meghan's public image emphasizes authenticity, transparency, and truth-telling. Yet critics argue her past appears increasingly opaque, guarded, and selectively erased. They question why certain years remain so thinly documented, why former connections rarely speak positively, and why controversy seems to follow even after withdrawal from royal life.
Yeah, so I get on a WhatsApp call with her, and I'm like, what do you have? She says, a guy sent me a tape of this model/actor.
Every resurfaced claim adds pressure. Every unanswered question becomes louder. And with each cycle, the narrative grows heavier, harder to control. This is no longer about a single rumor or a single critic. It's about a growing perception that something doesn't align. And in the world of public figures, perception often becomes reality. Because when a story refuses to disappear, people start asking not why it exists.
Specifically, the royal households are falling and scrambling to delete this to prevent more files from coming out.
But why it was hidden in the first place? And that is where this story truly begins. As the narrative intensified, attention shifted from Meghan's rise to the environment that made it possible. Critics argue that her story cannot be understood without examining the culture of influence that dominates elite social circles, a world where introductions matter more than resumes.
One missed DM and a diamond necklace away from being Joe Lowe's girlfriend, and after she ended up with the wrong prince, she had her Dubai pictures.
And proximity to power opens doors that talent alone cannot. Commentators have pointed out that Meghan appeared repeatedly in spaces where wealth, politics, and entertainment intersected. Private gatherings, invitation-only events, social settings where cameras were absent but connections were everything. To supporters, this reflected networking. To critics, it suggested something more deliberate, a pattern of calculated proximity to influence.
The email communications, and you'll see why. The woman in Canada who called me has it.
Online discussions began revisiting the term that would eventually dominate headlines again. Not as a confirmed label, but as a rumor that never fully disappeared. A phrase whispered for years, dismissed by some as misogynistic, yet revived whenever new commentary emerged. The persistence of that label says less about proof and more about perception, critics argue. Once a narrative takes hold, it becomes almost impossible to erase. Former industry insiders have fueled this perception by describing how aspirational figures are often introduced to elite lifestyles through informal arrangements. No contracts, no public acknowledgement, just access, discretion, and silence. Whether or not Meghan was involved in such dynamics has never been proven.
We have Virginia Roberts, may she rest in peace, where she was going to call Meghan Markle to testify in her civil case against Andrew.
But critics insist that the speculation alone has been amplified by her refusal to address it directly. Family conflict added another layer. When relatives publicly suggested that parts of Meghan's past had been deliberately scrubbed before her royal debut, the story took on a sense of urgency. Not because the claims were verified, but because they aligned too neatly with the image reset that occurred when she entered the royal orbit. Old acquaintances vanished, former friendships faded.
Drew, and therefore probably saw what he did. He also cited 3 reasons for Miss Markle to be a potential deposition.
A new identity emerged almost overnight. Observers began to question whether reinvention had crossed into erasure. Public records appeared thin. Photographic archives incomplete. Certain associations seemed to dissolve just as global attention intensified. To critics, this was not coincidence. It was crisis management before the crisis even began. What made the situation more volatile was timing. These renewed discussions often resurfaced during moments of professional decline. Canceled projects, strained partnerships, public fatigue.
She's in the US, so we have jurisdiction over her. 2, she is somebody who obviously, at least for a period of time.
Critics argue that when the curated image weakens, the suppressed questions rush back in. Media analysts have noted how Meghan's strategy shifted over time. Early interviews leaned heavily on empowerment and resilience. Later appearances emphasized victimhood and misunderstanding. Each phase, critics say, served a purpose. Each reframed the conversation just enough to redirect scrutiny.
And hence in a position to perhaps have seen what he did. And perhaps if not, have seen what he did to have heard people talk about it because she was in Jeffrey Epstein's.
But redirection has limits. In the age of archived content and viral rediscovery, nothing stays buried forever. Old interviews resurface. Clips circulate without context. Statements are replayed against new narratives. And contradictions, once noticed, cannot be unseen. Silence continued to be her most consistent response.
Sphere environment. Because of her past association with him, she may very well have important knowledge and will certainly have some knowledge.
No public clarification. No structured rebuttal. Supporters describe this as restraint. Critics describe it as avoidance. And the longer it lasted, the more viewers interpreted it as confirmation of something unresolved. What emerged was not a single accusation, but a fog of unresolved suspicion. A space where facts, rumors, and opinion blend into a narrative that feeds itself.
They're deleting images from Meghan Markle, who are, I don't see anything wrong with this image.
The absence of closure became the story, because in the public eye, unanswered questions don't fade, they multiply. And with every new voice that revisits the past, the image Meghan worked to construct appears a little less solid and a little more carefully assembled. It started quietly. No press release, no announcement, just a familiar name climbing the trending list again.
Epstein and any involvement with the royal family, but they're failing. These pictures that I'm about to show you have been banned from the internet.
Each time the public assumes the narrative has settled, something pulls it back open. A resurfaced clip, a forgotten interview, a comment from someone who claims to have known her long before palace gates and royal protocols entered the picture. Once that door cracks, the internet rushes in. Critics argue that Meghan's rise was never just about talent or timing. They point to the speed of her transformation, from a struggling actress to a global figure, as something that invites scrutiny. In an industry where access often matters as much as ability, observers question what unfolded in the years before her royal introduction. Years that, according to online commentators, now appear increasingly edited, long before titles and humanitarian speeches. Meghan was navigating elite social spaces where wealth,
Julia Petranemkova, which is another model friend who was there with Jeffrey Epstein.
Former acquaintances and commentators claim she moved through these circles with remarkable efficiency, appearing at invitation-only gatherings and private events usually reserved for the already powerful. Supporters frame this as ambition and networking. Critics call it strategy. As the narrative intensified, attention shifted from her rise to the environment that made it possible. A culture where introductions matter more than resumes, and proximity to influence opens doors talent alone cannot.
Nobody was mentioning Meghan Markle because she was a nobody. So she's getting away with a lot of things, but just like Sophia of Sweden, the bubble is about to burst, and the royal family have been dreading this moment.
Claims that parts of Meghan's past had been scrubbed before her royal debut aligned too neatly, critics said, with the dramatic image reset that followed. Old acquaintances faded. Former connections disappeared. A new identity emerged almost overnight. Online investigators stitched together timelines. Old photographs were scrutinized. Guest lists revisited. Events once dismissed as coincidence were re-examined with suspicion. Nothing confirmed. Nothing resolved. But enough, critics argue, to challenge the carefully curated origin story presented to the public. Silence followed. No lawsuits. No firm denials. No structured rebuttal. In modern media culture, silence is rarely neutral.
Leaked as part of this iCloud hack, which was obviously something that was criminal, and so that's the reason they were taken down from the internet. But what this Kevin Blatt is claiming...
Supporters describe it as dignity and restraint. Critics interpret it as calculation or avoidance. Algorithms, of course, interpret it as engagement. Timing only heightened the tension. These discussions often resurfaced during moments of professional strain, canceled projects, public fatigue, shifting partnerships. Media analysts noted how Meghan's messaging evolved over time. Early interviews emphasized empowerment and resilience. Later appearances leaned into misunderstanding and victimhood. Each phase, critics say, redirected scrutiny just enough to buy time. But redirection has limits.
To be different, it seems to be a suggestion that this was actually like a Kim Kardashian sort of moment, when it was almost planned. Do you know what I mean?
In an age of archived content and viral rediscovery, nothing stays buried forever. Old interviews resurface. Clips circulate without context. Statements are replayed against new narratives. Contradictions, once noticed, cannot be unseen. What ultimately emerged was not a single accusation, but a fog of unresolved suspicion. A space where rumor, opinion, and selective memory blend into a self-feeding narrative. The absence of closure became the story, because in the public eye, unanswered questions do not fade. They multiply. And with every new voice that revisits the past.
He has been dreading this moment, but there's nothing they can do. And I wonder if there's anything they want to do. Even in February 2016, this is right around the time she met Harry.
The image Meghan worked to construct appears a little less solid and a little more carefully assembled. As speculation widened, attention shifted to how Meghan handled pressure once she reached global visibility. Critics argue that her response to controversy revealed more than the controversy itself.
Dater's handbook, Polahan, I think his name is, where he said that Meghan Markle told him that she had met Harry in February.
Rather than confronting accusations directly, she appeared to reposition herself as the victim of a hostile system. Reframing scrutiny as persecution rather than inquiry, media commentators observed that this approach was strikingly consistent. When questions surfaced about her past or credibility, the conversation was redirected toward themes of sexism, racism, or institutional cruelty. These issues are real and serious, but critics argue they were deployed selectively, not to seek clarity, but to close debate. Once criticism is framed as bigotry, discussion becomes morally dangerous, and doubt itself is treated as wrongdoing. Initially, this strategy worked. Coverage softened. Skepticism became cautious. Challenging her narrative felt socially risky, but repetition weakened its power. Audiences began noticing patterns. Every challenge was followed by a narrative reset. Every contradiction met with moral deflection rather than explanation. As time passed, former allies and collaborators quietly distanced themselves.
Who was also part of that circle, we have her friends calling her for yacht week as early as February 2016, right before she met Harry.
Industry insiders began speaking anonymously, describing strained working relationships and environments where image control outweighed collaboration. These claims were never proven, but they accumulated. And accumulation, critics argue, is what reshapes reputations long before evidence ever appears. At the same time, attention turned toward the machinery behind Meghan's public image. Critics argue that what makes her case unusual is not scandal, but the intensity of narrative management surrounding it. Image control, in this view, was not a response to fame. It was the foundation of it. Long before royal life, she appeared acutely aware of branding, personal mythology, and selective storytelling.
He has been dreading this moment, but there's nothing they can do. And I wonder if there's anything they want to do. Even in February 2016, this is right around the time she met Harry.
Once global attention arrived, every appearance became strategic. Every silence calibrated. Questions about credibility were rarely addressed head-on. Instead, they were reframed. Doubt became harassment. Skepticism became cruelty. This reframing discouraged nuance while automatically rallying defenders. Over time, however, audiences grew wary of being told what they were allowed to question. As projects faltered and public fatigue set in. Critics noted a growing clash between grievance narratives and visible privilege. Multi-million-dollar deals, global platforms. Carefully staged vulnerability delivered from positions of immense power. The contrast became harder to ignore. Viewers began revisiting earlier interviews, comparing past statements with later ones. Details shifted. Dates evolved. Anecdotes changed tone depending on the audience. Supporters saw growth. Critics saw revisionism. What troubled observers most was the rigidity of the storytelling. Blame flowed outward. Institutions failed her. Family betrayed her. The media misrepresented her. Rarely, critics note, did accountability appear within her own narrative. Family estrangement intensified scrutiny. Reconciliation never materialized. Silence replaced dialogue. Critics argue that cutting off inconvenient voices preserved narrative control but weakened credibility. When only one version of events survives, suspicion grows. The royal departure amplified everything. Leaving the institution removed its protective buffer. Without palace protocols, contradictions traveled. As Meghan continued to evolve, critics began to argue that the most revealing element was not what she said, but what she consistently emphasized. Certain themes returned again and again with almost ritual precision: pain, injustice, betrayal, survival. Observers suggest these themes were not merely reflections of lived experience, but tools used to anchor public perception and guide emotional response. The repetition mattered because it shaped expectations. Audiences were conditioned to approach each new appearance anticipating emotional testimony rather than explanation. Critics argue this framing insulated Meghan from deeper scrutiny. If the audience was primed to feel first, analysis became secondary. Over time, however, emotional saturation produced diminishing returns. Familiar phrases, calibrated pauses, and recurring expressions began to feel rehearsed rather than raw. What once seemed intimate started to resemble performance. And performance, critics argue, invites evaluation. Attention also turned to contradictions in tone. Meghan frequently positioned herself as seeking privacy while engaging in highly public storytelling. Critics did not question her right to speak, but they questioned the framing. Privacy appeared selective, invoked to deflect difficult questions, while visibility was leveraged to dominate the narrative. If silence was protection, why speak so often? If exposure was harmful, why monetize it? These questions were rarely addressed directly. Instead, critics argue, they were reframed as attacks, discouraging further inquiry. Moral positioning became another point of contention. Meghan's narrative often placed her on the side of righteousness while assigning fault elsewhere. Institutions were cold. Critics were cruel. Family members were complicit. This binary framing, critics say, reduced complex situations into moral theater. But moral theater carries risk. Once audiences sense manipulation, sympathy can harden into resistance. Viewers begin asking whether every disagreement required a villain, and whether every setback demanded a narrative of oppression. As resistance grew, defenders became louder, polarizing discussion further. Meghan's image was no longer evaluated independently but filtered through loyalty. In some spaces, questioning her narrative was treated as evidence of malice. Critics argue this environment protected fragility rather than strengthening truth. By this stage, critics say the conversation shifted again, moving away from individual stories toward intent. The issue was no longer what happened, but why it was told this way. Audiences sensed the narrative was less about resolution and more about permanence. True healing stories evolve and close chapters. Meghan's appeared fixed in time. The same conflicts resurfaced with altered language but identical emotional framing, suggesting preservation rather than processing. This preservation, critics argue, served a purpose. As long as grievances remained unresolved, they could be revisited and redeployed. Each retelling renewed relevance. Pain became currency. Victimhood, once an experience, appeared to critics to become identity. Suffering was no longer something endured, but the lens through which everything else was interpreted. That lens narrowed discourse. If criticism equaled harm and skepticism equaled cruelty, disagreement itself became immoral. Dialogue gave way to compliance. Comparisons with other royal figures intensified, fair or not, shaping perception. Others endured scrutiny without constructing identities around grievance. Meghan's approach appeared singular, and singularity invites scrutiny. Questions of accountability followed. Critics argue Meghan positioned herself as the sole truth teller while others were silent, malicious, or constrained. This left little room for shared responsibility or misunderstanding. Human relationships are rarely that simple, and narratives that deny ambiguity often feel incomplete. As trust thinned, silence from Meghan's camp grew louder. Clarifications were rare. Corrections absent. Critics argue narrative dominance replaced engagement. But audiences had changed. They replayed interviews, compared statements, and shared interpretations. In this environment, controlled narratives struggled to hold. What emerged was credibility fatigue. Not hostility, but caution. Not outrage, but restraint. Applause softened. Curiosity faded. Attention shifted from empathy to evaluation, because narratives that demand belief without permitting questions eventually meet resistance. Not loud resistance, quiet resistance. The kind that withdraws trust rather than attacks. And once trust is withdrawn, no retelling can restore it without change. As the public conversation matured, critics began to argue that the most damaging element of Meghan's story was no longer controversy, but predictability. Each new appearance followed a familiar rhythm, a reflective tone, carefully chosen language, emotional emphasis placed exactly where audiences had come to expect it. What once felt spontaneous gradually felt anticipated. Predictability, critics say, is fatal to credibility. When audiences can forecast not just what will be said, but how it will be said, engagement turns into evaluation. Viewers stop listening for meaning and start listening for technique. Words are no longer absorbed emotionally, but examined strategically. This shift altered how even neutral statements were received. Phrases that might once have inspired empathy were instead dissected for intent. Was this revelation necessary? Was the timing deliberate? Was the vulnerability organic or curated? The very polish that once protected Meghan now invited suspicion. Critics argue this was intensified by an insistence on narrative centrality. Meghan's story increasingly positioned itself as emblematic of broader social struggles, elevating personal grievance into symbolic conflict. While some found this empowering, others felt it was disproportionate. Individual experiences were framed as universal truths, leaving little room for alternative perspectives or parallel suffering. Accountability became another fault line. Critics note that apologies, acknowledgments of misjudgment, or moments of self-reflection were largely absent. Growth was implied through shifting tone, but rarely demonstrated through ownership. The narrative evolved stylistically, not substantively. Instead, external forces remained the primary antagonists. Institutions, media, tradition, family. These entities were portrayed as powerful and oppressive, while Meghan was framed as resilient yet blameless. Critics argue this imbalance strained believability. Audiences are often forgiving when humility appears. They are less forgiving when certainty replaces reflection. As this framing persisted, please like, share, and subscribe for more.